Hi, my name is Chris and this is Battle Nonsense. Today we will have a look at the netcode of Black Squad from NS Studio, which is a development studio located in South Korea. Black Squad is a free-to-play first-person shooter that is currently in early access, and according to its Steam page features an amazing netcode. So I thought that this is an interesting claim that I should put to the test and find out how it stacks up against the competition. But before we do that, we have to talk about a few networking basics. The reason why I always include this basic information on YouTube while my patrons can get a cut to the chase version on Vimeo is that on YouTube I must consider that these videos attract new viewers who have never seen such a netcode analysis before. And since I've noticed that new viewers prefer to have all the information in one place rather than scattered across different videos, I decided to put in the extra effort and include this information whenever I test a game for the first time or when it's been a long time since the last one. So if this is your first netcode analysis, then I want to welcome you to my channel and you can simply continue to watch this video. If you have already seen one of these, then you can skip to the results of my tests by using the timecode link in the description, or in case that you are watching this on a mobile device, you can find a clickable timecode link in the pinned comment down below. So let's dive into the networking basics then, where we will start with the ping. Now, what is that and where does the term come from? If you've seen the movie The Hunt for Red October, then you might remember that scene where Sean Connery gave the order to use a single active sonar ping to re-verify their range to the target. The way this works is that your ship or submarine sends out an audio signal, which then gets reflected by other objects in the water. This reflection is then received by microphones or hydrophones installed on your ship. And that then allows you to determine the distance between you and that object by measuring the time between sending the audio signal and receiving the reflection. So when we talk about network connections, then the ping between different devices is pretty much the same thing. Your device sends an ICMP echo request to another network device like a game server, which then sends an ICMP echo reply back to your device. When we then measure the time between sending the request and receiving the answer, then we get the ping or round-trip time of the data. So the ping tells us how long data has to travel through the copper and fiber optic cables to reach the other device. And the longer it takes data to reach its destination, the greater the difference between what we see on our monitor and what the other players see on theirs, which is what we call lag. So when I jump, then it takes some time until that information reaches the server and then the other client. With short distances and good routing between the players and the server, this delay or lag is very low. However, the bigger the distance between the clients and the server, the longer it will take until these receive an update on what is happening. So the higher your ping, the more you will lag, which means that you have a bad experience. But it's not just the player with the high ping that suffers. Depending on how strong the lag compensation is in a game, the player with the high ping can also degrade the experience of players who have a low ping, as these then either receive damage far behind cover or get shot before they can even see the player with the high ping. Developers have tried many different solutions to fix or at least mitigate this issue. Some have tried to use a region lock, but that does not work, as network congestion can cause your ping to go from a stable 20 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds at any time. So what can be done? The brute force solution is to disconnect players who have a ping high enough to cause that issue. However, that will hurt your sales and communities which have members across the globe. DICE uses a quite interesting approach to attack this issue in Battlefield 1, which I want to show you now. Here we have a player with a ping of about 47 milliseconds, let's call him player 1. And then we got the shooter, player 2, who has a ping of about 147 milliseconds. When player 2 now fires at player 1, then the client of player 2 will run the hit registration, which figures out that player 1 has been hit. The client of player 2 then sends this information to the server, which runs its own check to confirm the hit. When the server agrees, then it sends the hit confirmation back to player 2 and the damage data to player 1. This form of hit registration is called client-side server authoritative, because while the client does the hit registration, the server must still confirm the hit or no damage will be dealt. When I then slightly increase the ping of player 2 to about 157 milliseconds, then player 2 gets the aim lead indicator, which tells him that his ping to the server is too high. When player 2 now fires at player 1 again, then the hit will not register anymore, because the hit registration now changed from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side. But when player 2 then leads his shot, which means that he just has to fire a little bit earlier, then the shot registers again. This allows player 2 to still hit other players while not making the issue of receiving damage behind cover worse. So once the ping of player 2 is higher than the configured threshold, his hit registration switches from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side, where the server won't compensate for the delay of player 2. This means that the only perspective that now matters is the one from the server and where he sees player 1 when it receives the information about the shot that player 2 fired. This is how DICE tries to mitigate the issue where players with low pings die far behind cover, while still allowing players from all over the world to come together and play their game. Now, what affects your ping to the game server or your lag in general? One factor that you already know of is the distance between you and the game server. However, it is not possible to determine your ping by taking a map and drawing a straight line between your home and the location where the server is hosted. Because the copper and fiber optic cables take a very different route, and the data that you send to the server has to pass through multiple routers before it reaches the server. So when a router has to forward data, then it tries to use the best route. This means that when everything works as it should, then your data should take the shortest route to the game server. However, it can happen that a router either chooses a bad route or that it has to choose a worse one when the better one is down. Such can then lead to quite big detours for your data, which can also result in much higher pings and an increased risk of packet loss, since your data might have to pass through many more routers then. So when you suddenly notice a much higher ping to your favorite server, then this could be caused by the routing. In this case, you will then have to call your internet service provider so that they can check their routing tables. If you want to get the issue fixed faster, then you can provide them with traceroute data for that server. For that, you open the command prompt, type in traceroute and the IP of the game server that you have problems with. You will then get a list of all the hops between you and the game server with the ping between you and each of these hops. However, please be aware that depending on its configuration, a hop might not reply to your ICMP echo request or with a greater delay. The same is true for game servers where many do not reply when you try to ping them from the command prompt. So the length of the route that connects the client to the server and the amount of hops between them affects how long it takes data to reach its destination. This means that the lag that we experience in a game can never be lower than the travel time of the data, unless we figure out a way to break the laws of physics to speed up the electrons or photons that are used for the communication between the client and the server. What adds an extra delay on top of the travel time of our data is how frequently we send and receive it. So when we send and receive 30 updates per second, then there is more time between updates than when we send and receive 60. So by sending and receiving more updates per second, you can decrease the additional delay that is added on top of the travel time of your data. But where is that data coming from? This is where the term tick or simulation rate comes into play, which is how many times per second the game processes and produces data. So when you have a tick or simulation rate of 60, then this will cause less delay than when you use a tick rate of 30. A tick rate of 60 will also allow the server to send 60 updates per second. But not only the number of simulations that are done per second is important. It's also critical that the server finishes a tick as fast as possible, because at a tick rate of 60 Hz it only has a processing window of 16.66 milliseconds, inside which it must finish a simulation step. So at the beginning of a new tick, the server starts to process the data it received and runs its simulations. After that, it then sends the results to the clients and then sleeps until the next tick happens. The faster the server finishes a tick, the earlier the clients will receive new data from the server, which reduces the delays between players and makes the hit registration feel more responsive. This is something that I showed in my Battlefield 4 tests, where the net graph displays the time the server needs to finish a tick. So when it comes to the server's performance, then it's imperative that it finishes a simulation step as fast as possible, or at least inside the processing window that is given by the tick rate. When it gets close to that limit or even fails to process a tick inside that time frame, then you will instantly notice this, as that results in all sorts of strange gameplay issues like rubber banding, players teleporting, hits getting rejected, physics failing, etc. Now, what kind of options do developers have when it comes to the network model? One solution is that you pay hosters to set up dedicated servers for your games in their data centers, to which the players then connect to. This means that your game server is running on powerful hardware and the data center has enough bandwidth to handle all those players that connect to it. Also, when the matchmaking makes sure that all players have more or less the same ping to the game server, then you can avoid that some players have an unfair advantage in some situations or give players with low pings a bad experience. The downside of dedicated servers is that if you don't have a game that builds around the idea of the community running these servers, then the publisher or studio has to pay for them and they are quite expensive. Another challenge is that if you release your game worldwide, then you must also make sure that all players who buy the game have access to low latency servers. If you do not do that, then you create many players with high pings, and that is a problem for your entire community, not just the players who don't have servers near them. A different approach, which many people falsely refer to as peer-to-peer, is that you simply use the PC or console of one of the players to host the game, which means that he essentially becomes the server. With this solution, the game studio does not have to pay for expensive dedicated servers, and it also allows players located in a remote region to play with their friends at relatively low latency. One of the many downsides that this network model is suffering from is that the player who is also the server gets an advantage, because he has zero lag. This causes that he will see you before you see him, and he can fire at you before you can fire at him. Then we also have the problem that all players connect to the host through his consumer-grade internet connection, when the worst case he could even use Wi-Fi. This frequently results in a lot of lag, packet loss, rubber banding, and an unreliable hit registration. But the most infuriating part of such a client-hosted match is the host migration, which is the process where the whole game pauses for several seconds while a different player is elected to replace the host that just left. Then we got the peer-to-peer network model, which you mostly see in 1v1 fighting games, but there are also a few other multiplayer games that have more than 2 players which use peer-to-peer. And since there are different variations of this network model, I will use For Honor as a reference in this explanation. So in this network model we do not have a dedicated game server, nor is a client elected to host the match and run the simulation. However, we at least need a session host which takes care of invites and handshakes. That could be done by a dedicated server, or like in For Honor, a client is used for that task, which is also why the game will pause for several seconds until a new session host has been elected should the previous one leave. Another downside is that because every client runs its own simulation, the responsiveness of the hit registration might also vary depending on the ping of the player you engage. So when you fight a player to which you have a ping of 5 milliseconds, then the hit registration might feel better than when you engage a player to which you have a ping of 148 milliseconds. Or players with a high ping make the hit registration less responsive in general, as the clients keep their simulation in sync. Probably the biggest downside of this network model is security, as every game client knows and sees the WAN IP addresses of the other players. Besides that, there are a few other concerns that this peer-to-peer network model has in common with client-hosted matches, like the impact of underpowered hardware used by the players, as well as the players' consumer-grade internet connection, as all clients talk to each other to keep their simulation in sync. And anti-cheat is also always a very big concern in games that do not have an authoritative game server. So even though dedicated game servers do not magically provide 100% lag-free connections, I believe that they offer the best possible experience in online multiplayer games where you have more than 2 players participating in a match. Now, before I show you the results of my tests, I want to explain how I measure the delay that 2 players are affected by in a multiplayer game. To test this, I use a high-speed camera, 2 PCs where each of them has its own fiber internet connection, and a 144Hz gaming monitor on which the game runs at more than 144 FPS with all graphic options set to the lowest value. To measure the delays between the players, I point my high-speed camera at the monitors and then have player 2 shoot 20 times at player 1. Inside the high-speed recording, I then look for the frame where I see that player 2 starts to fire, and then I count the frames until I see that the damage was received by player 1, which is indicated by either blood splatter, a damage indicator, or the update of the health indicator, depending on what happens first and what is available in the game. In addition to this damage delay test, I also check the delay of the gunfire animation, as well as the movement delay. Now let's talk about Black Squad. The good news first, Black Squad uses dedicated servers for both quick match and custom matches. But sadly, these are currently only available in Europe, North and South America, which means that you will see quite a lot of players who have a ping of 200 milliseconds or even more, simply because they don't have servers where they live. The game servers are provided by Amazon's cloud service AWS, which is quite easy to find out as we only have to take the IP address of the game server that the game client connects to and then search for it inside the AWS IP ranges list. This also tells us the exact location of that game server, and so we can simply ping the data center to find out that they have a ping of 16 to 17 milliseconds to that data center. This is also the only way how you can check your ping outside of the game, as the actual AWS game server is configured to ignore all ICMP data. When we then take a look at the scoreboard, then it becomes quite clear that the ping that we see here is not the result of an ICMP echo request. The value that the game shows us is most likely based on the game data and includes at least some of its processing delays. Which is not necessarily a bad thing. You could even make the argument that including the processing delays results in a more accurate representation of the player's delay. The only problem is that some games show the result of an ICMP echo request, while others use the delay of the game data and include the processing delays, so it gets a bit confusing for players when they try to compare their ping between different games. Now, how about the tick and update rates? I used Wireshark to capture the network traffic between my game client and the game server during a round of Team Deathmatch, which lasted for about 7 minutes. This data then shows us that during those 7 minutes I received 30 packets per second on average from the server, while the game client sent 42 packets per second on average to the server. Now, there is no test that allows us to determine the tick rate that the server is running at. However, since the server sends 30 updates per second to the client, it's quite likely that the server also runs at a tick rate of 30 Hz, simply because you wouldn't run the server at a tick rate higher than its send rate, as you don't gain much from that, while the server needs more resources then, and that means that it becomes more expensive. Before we then move on to the network delay, let's have a quick look at the traffic. After 1 hour of playing Team Deathmatch, the Black Squad game client uploaded 13.1 megabytes of data to the server and received 18.82 megabytes of data from the server. So if your internet connection can handle that amount of data, then you should not have a problem playing Black Squad. I also want to make clear that the results that you see here are by no means a rating. I just want to give you an idea of how much or little traffic is created by today's multiplayer games. Now let's have a look at the network delay, or how much lag two players experience when they play on the same server. In my damage delay test I measured an average delay of 45 milliseconds. The gunfire test showed an average delay of 47 milliseconds, and in the movement test I measured an average delay of 48 milliseconds. When we then compare these results to those from the Lawbreakers test, which was done at about the same ping but runs at a tick rate of 60 Hz, then the network delays of Black Squad are indeed amazing for a game that has average update rates of 42 and 30 Hz. To be honest, when I first saw these results, I thought that I made an error and repeated the delay tests 2 more times on 2 different servers. However, the results were always the same. But how can a game with these low average update rates have a network delay that nearly matches a game that runs at a tick rate of 60 Hz? So I had to dig a little deeper to find out what is going on here, and what I found was quite unexpected. On the right you can see a graph from Wireshark, where the green line tells us how many packets per second my game client sends to the server, and the red line tells us how many packets per second my game client receives from the server. Right now I send and receive just 5 packets per second, which means update rates of only 5 Hz. Now look what happens when the other players start to move. The server then increases its send rate to up to 30 updates per second, while my client still just sends 5 updates per second as I am not moving. When the other player stands still again, then the server's send rate drops back down to just 5 Hz. When I then start to move around, then the server's send rate also increases up to 30 Hz. However, my client will send up to 120 updates per second to the server. So based on what we see here, it almost seems like the game is not only increasing its update rates when it's needed, but data might also get sent as soon as possible or almost immediately, which then explains how Black Squad can have these low network delays while its average update rates are just 42 and 30 Hz. One thing that I learned from this test is that I better always expect the unexpected, because I thought that this netcode analysis would be pretty straightforward and rather boring. I really did not expect to get puzzled by the network delay results and then find those dynamic update rates. But this made the test and hopefully the video more interesting, so I'm really happy that this happened. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the low amount of server locations causes that many players must play at a ping of 150 milliseconds or even more. As a result, a player with a ping of just 17 milliseconds will receive a hit behind cover when he gets shot by a player who has a very high ping, like 200 milliseconds in this example. This can be infuriating for the player who has a low ping to the game server, as his online experience suffers while he did nothing wrong. And it especially stings when you die as a result of that hit. Now, what would I like to see the developers work on in the near future? First and foremost, they must add more server locations to lower the amount of players who are forced to play at a ping of more than 150 milliseconds. A built-in FPS limiter would also be a welcome addition, especially for those of us who have a FreeSync or G-Sync monitor. And lastly, I somehow have to ask for this a lot, even though you would think that this one is obvious for an online game. Black Squad must tell the player when he is suffering from packet loss, lots of latency variation or a high ping. Right now you only see your latency inside the scoreboard, but there is no other indicator that your connection to the server has problems. So I hope that you enjoyed this hopefully interesting netcode analysis of Black Squad. And if you like this kind of content where I take a look at the inner workings of video games and show you how these affect your experience, then you can help to cover the costs of this channel by supporting me on Patreon. Without the support of my patrons, I really could not continue to bring you these netcode or input delay tests. So if you want to support me as well, then you can find the link in the description down below. Also, if you want to stay up to date on what I'm currently working on, then you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook. The links are also in the description of this video. And if you don't want to miss the next one, then you might want to subscribe to my channel and click on that little bell icon below this video to receive a notification when I upload the next one. So if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, subscribe for more, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, have a nice day and take care. My name is Chris and this was Battle Nonsense.